In this second video, we'll look at some of the causes of the American Revolution as they unfolded in the early years from 1763 to 1765. If the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening sort of laid the foundation, there were certainly economic causes as well. And you've got to start with the French in the central part of the United States. New France had been settled about the same time that the English had settled along the East Coast. But unlike the English, who densely settled their lands and consistently grew westward, the French claimed a wide swath of land but had few people there. And as the English grew westward, as the years passed, a conflict was inevitable. This conflict occurred in the late 1750s and early 1760s. And in America, it's known as the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. The British called it the French and Indian War because from their perspective, they were fighting not only the French, but the Indians who allied with them. The Indians saw the less densely populated French as better than the densely populated British. But there's going to be a war that lasts until 1763 in which the British would win. During the war, the British thought it best to sort of coordinate their colonies to better fight the French and Indians. And so they promoted a union of some of the northern colonies called the Albany Plan of Union, Albany, New York. And it didn't have a whole lot of effect, but it was the first time that anybody had promoted the idea of a union of colonies. And certainly, while unintended by the British, this idea is going to germinate later with the American Revolution. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. By the way, the Treaty of Paris of 1763 is often confused with the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution, 1783. Don't make that mistake. But this Treaty of Paris, 1763, completely removed the French from the New World. The British got all of the former New French lands all the way out to the Mississippi, and that includes the French territories in Canada. The British got Florida as well, which had been Spanish. In exchange, Spain got all the lands west of the Mississippi. Spain had helped Britain, and they saw that as a benefit. What this meant, however, was that the British had an awful lot of land now to govern, and that, of course, cost a lot of money. The British very quickly realized that it's going to cost a lot of money to govern this vast new area. And besides that, winning the war had, it cost a lot of money. And they had a very large war debt that they needed to pay off. About this time, George III, who was only aged 22, came to the British throne, and he was very unprepared for the job. He followed his grandfather, George II, and he had been groomed for the job his whole life, but it was sudden because everybody assumed that his father, George III's father, would get it from his father, but his father had died suddenly, so the grandson, George III, took over. And George III was insecure and relied on hard-nosed advisors to sort of try his insecurities. He wanted to prove that he was worthy. With his advisors pushing him, George III decided to issue in 1763 a proclamation line. And what it did was it forbade colonists to settle west of a line drawn from Canada to Georgia, pretty much along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And they stated reason was they wanted to prevent future Indian wars, but there were other reasons, surely, that keeping the American colonists along the East Coast would allow them a little more control over the colonies. And also, the British merchants wanted to control the fur trade in this Northwest that the French had had. And so if they kept the American colonists from spreading up there, then that would give a chance for the British interests more directly to control that trade. But either way, the proclamation line of 1763 angered the American colonists. The insecure George III also decided to leave about 10,000 British troops in America to enforce the proclamation line and sort of flex British muscle, demonstrate British sovereignty. When George III settled on a new prime minister, George Grenville, Grenville decided that the best way to help pay for the war was to make the colonists pay, because in the theory the colonists, in his view, had benefited the most from the war. They'd rid them of the pesky Indians and the French. And so Grenville was willing to consider direct British taxes on the American colonists. The British, to this point, had only controlled trade with the colonists, mercantilistic regulations on trade, and they left issues of taxation to individual colonial governments. One of the first things that Grenville did after coming into office was get Parliament to pass the Revenue Act of 1764, famously known as the Sugar Act of 1764. I had said that the British had not taxed the colonies directly, but had regulated trade. Well, one of their regulations was a duty on imported molasses into the colonies, and that was kind of a direct taxation, but the Americans had largely avoided it because it was easy to smuggle in molasses. The Americans got very cheap molasses from the French. Molasses, by the way, is a product of growing sugar and is used in the making of rum. Anyway, the French didn't really like molasses and the Americans loved it, so they provided it cheaply to the Americans, and the Americans just smuggled it in. Well, what Grenville decided to do was lower the duty or tax on the imports of molasses, but at the same time raise the penalty for smuggling to really make smuggling much more better enforced. And with better enforcement, that way they could raise money. They would stop the smuggling, even though technically it was a lower duty. And so from now on, the British vessels were very much more actively searching the coast of America looking for the smugglers. And that angered the Americans because it meant that they would be paying more. As Grenville began to enforce a tax on sugar, it is really the first time the Americans were sort of paying a direct British tax. And Grenville, however, wasn't going to stop there. He also got Parliament to pass the Currency Act of 1764, which prohibited the colonists from printing their own paper money. The colonists had been printing their own money for some time because British money was specie-based. That's like gold and silver or precious metals, and that meant that it was limited. And this, limited money, it stunted colonial economic growth. Now, after the French and Indian War, many colonial governments had begun to print a lot more of their paper money, their own paper money, and many colonial businesses had begun paying their debts to British merchants with it. And the British merchants were upset because of its depreciated value and wanted the British government to require that all colonists pay their debts only with British currency. And so that resulted in the Currency Act of 1764. Finally, Grenville in 1765 passed the Stamp Act, and that was not even arguably a regulation of trade. It was a flat-out direct tax passed by Parliament on all printed items, and that included a long list of things, licenses for in court documents and newspapers or published pamphlets. And whenever the tax had been paid, the publisher would display a prominent stamp on that publication. Now, the Currency Act was arguably just a regulation of trade, the British would say, and the Americans had largely ignored the earlier tax on sugar until the Sugar Act was now being enforced. And so the Americans were really angered by this movement towards direct taxation. It was no way the British were going to call the Stamp Act anything but a direct tax. It had nothing to do with trade at all. Part of the thing that angered the colonists the most about direct taxation from the British government was they felt they had no representation in Parliament. They would say, we're being taxed without representation, and there should be no taxation if you aren't represented. The Americans saw representation as direct representation. By that, I meant assembly members were elected from specific districts or areas, and they were responsible only to it. This is the way the American colonial governments had begun to grow up. But in Parliament, people weren't elected from any specific area or district, but rather represented all the citizens, and this was called virtual representation. So when the Americans said, hey, no taxation without representation, the Americans were speaking of direct representation. The British said, hey man, you are represented because Parliament represents all of Britain and you are part of Britain. So it was a misunderstanding of what they were talking about there. About this time, the author James Otis, who was a Massachusetts attorney, published a book called The Rights of British Colonies, Asserted and Proved. And he acknowledged that British history implied citizens had to follow Parliament, but he also said that virtual representation wasn't working. So he kind of tried to formally propose direct representation. His book became another bestseller as people debated his proposals, but the British were very quick to reject it. As a number of colonial legislatures began to debate Otis's book and the legitimacy of the Stamp Act, the Virginia legislature, known as the House of Burgesses, sort of took the lead. In the House of Burgesses was a young legislator named Patrick Henry, and he's going to propose something called the Virginia Resolves. Henry was 29 years old and serving his first term in the House of Burgesses. He was, as he later recalled, quote, young, inexperienced, unacquainted with the forms of the House and the members that composed it, unquote. He was the son of a Scottish immigrant to the Virginia frontier and had little formal education. He'd been a failed shopkeeper, and he turned to the law to support his wife and 6 kids. Now, he didn't have any formal legal training, but he distinguished himself by being a great public speaker. Anyway, angered that his fellow legislators seemed too passive in the face of the Stamp Act, he made 7 proposals. But the majority of the legislators were not present at that day. They had returned to their homes. The first of his proposals simply said that the colonists were British citizens with formal rights, including the right to tax. And the others were more radical, saying that only the House of Burgesses could actually tax Virginians. And the last said that anyone who agreed with the Stamp Act and opposed direct representation was an enemy to Virginia. Well, the Speaker of the House yelled out, calling Henry a traitor. Now, legend has it that Henry replied, quote, if this be treason, then make the most of it. Maybe he said, give me liberty or give me death. We're not sure what actually Henry said. Some even claim that he tried to back away. But it really didn't matter. The next day, a majority of legislators are present, and while the minority that had been there when Henry had made his speech had passed the resolves, the majority the next day had negated it. They'd repealed it. Nevertheless, again, the newspapers printed all 7, and other colonial assemblies read about it and got them fired up. Henry's going to go down famous in history with, you can see this picture here, give me liberty and give me death, whether or not it was true or not. Fired up by Henry's publicity, 9 colonial assemblies sent delegates to New York City in the fall of 1765, and this meeting became known as the Stamp Act Congress. It was very cautious, and the delegates simply acknowledged the right of Parliament to govern them, and they petitioned the king to lift the Stamp Act, to repeal it. While the Stamp Act Congress was pretty moderate, there were nevertheless colonial radicals. And after George III essentially ignored the Stamp Act's petition, these radicals began to grow, and they kind of stormed vigilante groups known as the Sons of Liberty. They would encourage street demonstrations and terrorize tax collectors, things like tarring and feathering them. They drop them in tar and put feathers all over them and make them look silly, and they could burn them anyway. But most of the tax collectors, by the way, were fellow Americans. A leader of the radicals and the Sons of Liberty was a distant cousin of John Adams, Samuel Adams. At the time, he was 43 years old. He was the son of a prosperous brewer and had attended Harvard College. You might think of him from, Samuel Adams beer that has on the bottle, Brewer Patriot. Anyway, he had actually been a tax collector himself, but he didn't care much about wealth or status and kind of wore less fancy clothes and was kind of known as a firebrand or a real troublemaker to enemies. He burned all of his correspondence, by the way, so history doesn't know a whole lot about him. But he called for street demonstrations in Boston in August 1765. And, he began to burn effigies of the king, and the governors really were getting upset. And all of this growing tension sort of led to a Stamp Act crisis in late 1765. It actually led to a sort of a mob vandalizing, storming one of the tax collector's offices and vandalizing his home as well. That tax collector, by the way, resigned. But anyway, this was the Stamp Act crisis. Following the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, or at least as the Stamp Act crisis raged, George III picked a new British Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. You can see in George III, he's going to go through a lot of prime ministers. Again, he was kind of insecure. But Rockingham thought it was best to diffuse tensions, but was looking for some way to do so while asserting the right of Parliament to tax all British citizens, including American colonists. So as 1765 began to pass, you're going to see, Rockingham taking over and Britain going a new direction. This concludes the events between 1763, the end of the French Indian War, and 1765, as the colonists moved increasingly towards revolution.